Hello class, in this video I'm going to talk about James Rachel's argument in favor of active voluntary euthanasia. In his article he goes over two arguments, both in favor of active voluntary euthanasia. The first one, which he calls the utilitarian argument, he thinks doesn't work, and he shows why he thinks it doesn't work in the paper. And the second argument is a revised version of the first argument, and the second argument he thinks is successful. So let me go over the first argument, I'll go over his objections to it, and then I'll present his final argument, which he thinks is successful. Okay, the first argument, the utilitarian argument, starts with the premise that our only moral obligation is to promote the greatest amount of utility that we can. And we do this by promoting health and well-being and by preventing suffering in the world. Specifically in the medical context, promoting the health and well-being of patients and preventing them from suffering. The second premise in this argument is that some instances of active voluntary euthanasia meet this requirement. So consider a terminally ill patient who's experiencing a great deal of suffering. By terminating this patient's life, we may, on the whole, be preventing more suffering than positive experiences for this patient's life. So by ending their life, we are meeting the requirement of the principle of utility. So therefore, in these cases, active voluntary euthanasia would be morally permissible. Okay, so that's the utilitarian argument. He thinks that there are two problems with this argument. The first problem, he thinks, is with the first premise, which is that the principle of utility is our only moral obligation. He thinks this is not true. He thinks that we have other obligations as well, such as our obligations to respect patient autonomy, obligations of justice, so on and so forth. So to claim that utility is our only moral consideration is too narrow for him, too short-sighted. Okay, and his second objection to this argument is that it has a very counterintuitive implication. He thinks that this utilitarian argument might condone certain instances of active involuntary euthanasia. That is, if this argument is correct, it may imply that we have obligations to terminate some patients' lives who do not want to die. Why might this be so? Well, some patients are experiencing a great deal of suffering, however they say they don't want to die. But if we go against their wishes and terminate their life anyway, we may be still in accordance with the principle of utility. By reducing the amount of suffering that this person is experiencing, we may be maximizing utility more so than if we were to allow them to remain living. But this strikes us as so counterintuitive that we might be able to terminate a patient's life against their will, that there must be something wrong with this utilitarian argument. Okay, so he tries to revise this argument. He thinks there's something right about this argument, that we have obligations to promote patient well-being and reduce suffering. But it has these counterintuitive implications, so he tries to revise it in the following way. So his revised argument starts with the first premise, which is that we have an obligation to promote patient utility and respect patients' rights. The next premise is that some instances of active voluntary euthanasia meet this requirement. So, for example, if a patient is in a great deal of suffering, they have a terminal illness, and this patient wants to die, they explicitly request that they be allowed to have their life terminated, then in that case, going through with the procedure, terminating their life, does in fact promote the principle of utility because it reduces the amount of suffering that's in the world. And since they explicitly request for their life to be ended, it's not violating any of their rights. So his revised version of the utilitarian argument just adds the further stipulation that when we're considering whether to end a patient's life, we have to be sure that it both maximizes utility and it respects their autonomous request. It doesn't violate their rights. Okay, so that's his argument in favor of some instances of active voluntary euthanasia.